Anyone studying Portuguese Empire history quickly encounters this impressive reality. Extremely small armies facing grand military formations and almost always coming out victorious in battles, whether on land or at sea. And all this soon leads us to a question. How, after all, did a small kingdom on the edge of the Iberian Peninsula manage to defeat armies that were often much larger? How did the Portuguese manage to conquer North Africa and still dominate trade routes on the other side of the world? And how did these conquests also influence the greatest failures of the Kingdom of Portugal? In today's video, we'll explore how Portugal won numerous battles while outnumbered and examine how these victories and myths shaped Portuguese nationalism. But before we start the video, if you like our content, become a member of our channel right now. That way, you'll have access to our group and exclusive content, including live classes, to further explore histories behind the scenes. To understand how Portugal always won battles with so few soldiers, we need to go back to the very genesis of the Portuguese nation at the Battle of Ourique. Portugal's founding myth centers on Dom Afonso Henriques defeating 5 Moorish kings from the taifas of Évora, Beja, Badajoz, Elvas, and Seville. Afonso, before this victory, is said to have had an epiphany with Christ himself, and after the battle was acclaimed as the King of the Portuguese. Later, the Treaty of Zamora in 1143 granted him independence. And Afonso Henriques very skillfully negotiates Portuguese independence with his cousin Afonso VII. At the same time, he already submits the kingdom's vassalage to the Pope as a way to escape his own cousin's ambitions. And an interesting point in the development of the Portuguese state was precisely the centrality of its monarchy. In Portugal, power was always in the hands of the king, unlike in Castile, where the nobility was very strong and sometimes challenged the crown. The Portuguese centralized much authority in the king, to the point that some, like Sancho II, Afonso II, and Afonso II, were even excommunicated by the Catholic Church for trying to take their lands and restrict the privileges of the bishops. However, for the nobility, even though they were not as powerful as in other kingdoms, keeping the country independent was also a way to remain influential, since moving the capital to a distant land and having to compete with the already established foreign nobility would further diminish their power. In other words, a centralized and nearby monarchy was more advantageous for them than a less centralized but distant king, already surrounded by powerful nobles. There would be no space left for positions, influence, or roles in military orders. And, beyond centralism, Portugal was developing at the very core of the kingdom, a founding myth that grew stronger every day, even linking Portuguese independence itself to divine will. As researcher Cleonice Berardinelli notes, Ourique marks the first step in expanding both the faith and the empire. The more is the enemy and fighting them is praised. It is necessary to defeat them to begin the advance towards the south, which will reach the Algarve and continue across the sea. The uncertain battle, a Portuguese king against 5 Moorish kings, 100 faithful men. For Christians, suddenly a miracle. The crucified Christ appears to all. Spirits rise. It's the Portuguese victory. And in this sense, there were many battles that contributed to the strengthening of the myth of Lusitanian superiority. First, we have the battles of the crisis of the Portuguese succession, which heroically founded the Avis dynasty after the surprising victories in the battles of Aljubarrota, Valverde, and Atoleiros. In these battles, the Castilians had armies that were much larger than the Portuguese. In the case of Aljubarrota, the Portuguese had 6 times fewer troops than the invaders and still managed to win in battles like the Battle of Salado. Only 1,000 Portuguese knights completely disorganized the Moorish forces, with King Afonso IV personally leading a cavalry charge against the enemy army. The invasion of Ceuta, the pioneer in the conquest of North Africa, right in the Middle Ages, just like impressive victories such as the Battle of Diu and the conquests and feats of Afonso de Albuquerque, fueled in Portuguese poets the myth of a Lusitanian military superiority, stemming from an innate bravery of the Portuguese man compared to other Europeans. Always connected with the divine will, something that is greatly emphasized by Camões in the Lusíads. The poet, stirring up Portuguese nationalism, greatly helps in spreading this innate bravery. At the same time that he exalts the epic of Vasco da Gama, helped by the gods of Olympus on his journey to the ends of the known and unknown world. But what Camões ignores is that sometimes the Portuguese also lost battles because of recklessness and especially overconfidence. The disaster of Tangier is one of the greatest examples, where Prince Dom Henrique, after personally commanding the conquest of Ceuta, believed it was possible to conquer Tangier, which was larger and better protected. And he believed it was even possible to conquer the city, only with the orders of Aves and Christ, since his brother the king refused to join the expedition. Everything ends in disaster, leading to Prince Dom Fernando's capture and later death as a hostage. In exchange for the return of Ceuta, Camões, in the Lusíads, does not mention the disaster of Tangier by name, only referring to the martyrdom of Dom Fernando in Canto 4 stanzas 52 and 53 Camões. He also does not directly mention that King Dom Fernando had tried to invade Castile during the Castilian crisis and lost the so-called Fernandine Wars. He only refers to him as weak, who put the kingdom in jeopardy as a result of the invasion of Castile. A king who, in his words, being weak, made strong people weak. This praise of Portuguese bravery and strength by the poet would reach the ears of the young king of Portugal, Dom Sebastião, and Sebastião, enchanted by such heroic verses. He also wanted to be not only an exponent of the Lusitanian crusade, but also a crusader king, like his ancestor Dom Afonso Henriques did in his day. And that would lead to one of the greatest Portuguese fiascos, which took place at Alcácer Quibir. There, a series of mistakes made by the young and reckless king would cause one of the worst defeats in the history of the Portuguese army, with nobles of the highest rank bogged down and taken hostage in the Moroccan deserts, fighting against Moorish troops that outnumbered them 4-1 on the battlefield. And Portuguese nationalism would claim another victim years later, when Antonio, the prior of Crato, according to historian Joaquim Veríssimo Serrão, in his work O Brasil Filipino, was advised to flee to Brazil. There, he would found a new kingdom in exile, backed by foreign powers, and later reclaim the kingdom. But Dom Antonio ignored the requests, believing he could defeat Philip II and the experienced Duke of Alba, relying on past achievements and the distant battle of Aljubarrota. Thus, it can be seen that this belief in blind nationalism was not something exclusive to Dom Sebastião, but of an entire generation of Portuguese people, including survivors of Alcácer Quibir. Like Dom Antonio and unlike Dom Sebastião and Dom Antonio, the great Portuguese strategists knew how to combine nationalism and faith with strategy. We have as an example St. Nuno Álvares Pereira, who, having contact with the English troops stationed in Portugal, masterfully applied many tactics learned from the English in the 100 Years' War, especially the tactic of taking advantage of rough terrain. Thus he chooses the perfect terrain to corner and defeat the Castilians at the Battle of Atoleiros. Later, he would repeat this on a larger and even more brilliant scale at Aljubarrota. So, while Nuno was full of cunning and religiosity, at Alcácer Quibir there was only empty arrogance, believing that battles could be won just for being Portuguese and for having God on their side. Even the camp, which is set up on Moroccan soil, it was one of the terrible choices that cornered the Portuguese troops, leaving everyone within range of the Moors' cannons. So, they do literally the opposite of what Nuno did at Aljubarrota. He chose the fortified ground within range of the English archers and set up several traps for the French cavalry. In this way, The greatest Portuguese victories and achievements didn't happen just because they were Portuguese, but because they were accomplished by people with cunning and great experience. To fulfill his role, Alfonso IV, before undertaking the famous battle against the Moors at the Battle of Salado, had already waged a war against his own father, so that his father wouldn't favor the illegitimate son and take him off the throne. Even Afonso Henriques himself, before the legendary Battle of Urique, had already fought against his own mother at the Battle of Somemede. And here comes a point of extreme importance that is rarely highlighted. The very nature of the Portuguese state forced the country to always ensure its independence. Portugal covers just 1/6 of the Iberian Peninsula, while Castile, Leon, Navarre, and Aragon in Spain have a territory 5 times larger. Thus, Portugal needed competent people to remain independent, whether in the diplomatic, political, or military sphere. Besides the famous partnership with the English, Portugal has always had good relations with Aragon as a way to counterbalance Castilian influence. And, in addition, espionage is also used to anticipate the neighbor's moves, and we can see this through the Lusitanian navigation maps. The Cantino map, which showed the world known to the Portuguese in 1502, displays the lands known by Portugal, such as Brazil, Asia, and even Canada. But the map also included the Antilles of the King of Castile, even though the Portuguese had never sailed beyond Tordesillas to the Caribbean. And that's because they probably had access to the maps of Juan de la Cosa, which perfectly documented the Caribbean islands and the northern coast of Venezuela. Portugal kept spies inside Castile so they could anticipate any move from the neighboring kingdom. And, in the same way, the commanders who led the ships were usually people experienced in the art of war and navigation. We can mention as an example Afonso de Albuquerque, who took part in expeditions in North Africa, Castile, and the Mediterranean before imposing iron and fire in the Indian Ocean, subjecting it to the Portuguese rule. And even though inexperienced leaders like Pedro Álvares Cabral could be rewarded, with the expedition leaders, they were always accompanied by other great navigators and military leaders. Such was the case of Bartolomeo Diaz, who rounded the Cape of Good Hope and was with Cabral on his expedition. In Brazil, captaincies that allied with indigenous peoples like São Vicente, with the Tupinicans, and Pernambuco with the Tabajaras, were the ones that prospered. The same strategy was repeated in the East. Diplomatic agreements in Macau and fortresses in India and Indonesia, always backed by gunpowder when necessary. Portugal, with only 1 million inhabitants in the 16th century, would never have been able to monopolize the Indian Ocean routes, fighting against Arabs, Indians, and later, Japanese and Chinese, only relying on gunpowder without having made profitable trade agreements with those peoples. We can see then that the kingdom did not win because the Portuguese were braver. After all, men who lost great battles were also brave. Portugal won when it had competent leaders, strategic allies, and diplomatic cunning. And at the same time, it lost whenever it believed in the myth of its own invincibility, thus proving that Portugal's strength always lay more in the intelligence and competence of its commanders than in the number of its swords.